The Freedom broadcast continues. Next, we will talk about how U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio held a meeting with Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov in the Philippine capital, Manila. According to Rubio, one of the main topics of the talks was Russia's war against Ukraine. At the same time, Washington intends to facilitate its resolution. According to Russian media, the meeting lasted 37 minutes. As reported by the Foreign Ministry of the aggressor country, at the meeting Lavrov once again confirmed, as they themselves stated, their commitment to the Anchorage agreements.
On Bankova Street, they believe that the Kremlin's attempts to present itself as a party ready for peace no longer work. According to Mikhailo Podolyak, advisor to the head of the Office of the President of Ukraine, US President Donald Trump has already drawn several fundamental conclusions about the Russian dictator Putin.
Now, Trump understands three basic things about Putin. First, is he ready to accept this, and is he ready to make the final conclusion that Putin will disappear? First, Putin always lies. Second, Russia is nowhere near demonstrating what they claim in their propaganda, in Putin's own statements, and so on. And finally, third, Putin cannot be sold on any market as a positive figure, a good guy who wants a deal, even in the United States, even within the Republican Party.
Joining us to discuss this topic is Mikhailo Sinayuk, an expert with the Russian and Belarusian Studies program at the Ukrainian PRISM Analytical Center. Mikhailo, hello. Thank you for finding the time to join us.
Good morning.
Greetings.
So, in your opinion, what was the main goal of each side here, I mean Rubio and Lavrov, in this meeting? What was each side trying to achieve? And in your opinion, did either side ultimately succeed?
Well, first of all, it should be emphasized that the assumption that the main topic of these negotiations would be focused specifically on Ukraine is, in my assessment, quite a significant oversight or presumption. Because the position of both sides coming into these negotiations is that Russia, look, it's the end of July now. In 2 months, they will have elections for the State Duma. And after that, most likely, according to both my own assessment and those of my colleagues, they will be forced to proceed with mobilization. This is a forced step. The elites in Russia understand perfectly well that it is very risky. It could shake both the economic stability, which, to be honest, is already quite fragile in Russia, and the socio-political stability. Therefore, Russia's primary interest in these negotiations is, so to speak, to try one last chance to resolve this crisis without resorting to mobilization. They expect that Ukraine is capable. No, let's put it this way. They are not ready for negotiations with Ukraine because, well, their position is not yet weak enough, in their view, to sit down at the negotiating table with Kyiv. Nevertheless, they see that Kyiv's position is quite independent, particularly when it comes to strikes on logistics and oil and gas infrastructure. And their hopes are focused on Washington being able to exert some kind of pressure to change Kyiv's position, to make it more accommodating, and possibly to influence the cancellation or reduction of long-range strikes. At the same time, the United States, they see, yes.
Mikhail, well, look, just the other day, that gloomy Minister Lavrov was speaking so cockily. I'm going to meet with Rubio and ask him what President Trump really meant when he talked about a quick end to the war, which in fact the Kremlin itself started against independent Ukraine. And so the meeting actually took place. Funny thing is, it was really short, just 37 minutes. In that time, they probably managed to say hello, say goodbye, and maybe ask how things are going. That's it. Basically, they probably didn't have time for anything else. So, in the end, what do you think? Did Lavrov actually have time to ask about this? And what could Rubio have answered him? What do you think? When did Washington really change its rhetoric? We've all witnessed this recently. Then here's the second part of the question. Mikhail, what do you think when Washington really talks about a speedy end to the war? What do they mean by that?
Washington is well aware of Russia's position both externally and internally. They clearly see the burning warehouses and oil refineries. They clearly see the Moscow exchange indices, which are hitting new lows with every opening, so to speak. And they understand that Russia will most likely have to resort to mobilization, which the Russian elites themselves do not want, as I mentioned earlier. Therefore, overall, this entire meeting and Washington's hopes are focused on, so to speak, hearing a more constructive position from Russia. They fully understand that Russia is now ready to make more significant compromises than it was willing to make a year ago during Anchorage. And most likely, Washington wants to hear from Russia some, as I already said, more constructive proposals, not regarding conflict resolution, which is very important. As I have already mentioned, the Ukrainian issue is not central to these negotiations. In these negotiations, the central focus is precisely the relationship between Moscow and Washington as two, let's say, regional actors, right? Therefore, America is now going to expect some kind of move from Russia, a serious one, so that, let's say, in its confrontation with China, Russia would be more favorable toward Washington's position.
Speaking of Washington's position, let's also discuss the news that the US Senate has included the bill on support for Ukraine in its calendar after the second reading, which in turn means that the document can be brought up for consideration during a plenary session. And the bill itself provides for further support for Ukraine, as well as new sanctions against Russia. The last procedural step on the document was taken on July 20th. What is very important is that this document is not related to the late Senator Lindsey Graham's bill on new sanctions against Russia, yes? So we already have several bills in the Senate in support of Ukraine, because in particular sanctions against Russia are also part of the support for Ukraine. How do you feel about this initiative? How would you comment on it? And in general, how will Russia respond to this?
Well, what has changed the most in sanctions policy under the new administration in the United States is that sanctions, from being a tool to support Ukraine, have increasingly become a tool to put pressure on Russia and, let's say, to reduce its potential on the international stage. Therefore, these sanctions, this bill, fit very well into the overall framework of relations between Washington and Moscow, including the negotiations that are currently taking place in Manila. As I mentioned earlier, the United States expects a more constructive approach from Russia. Some proposals, compromises that Russia, let's say, is now more willing to make than it was a year ago. And these sanctions are a demonstration that in the event of no progress or advancement in these negotiations, let's say, the next measure will be applied, one that will hit the Kremlin very hard at a time when, on the contrary, it needs to mobilize its resources as much as possible, including financial ones, in order to get through the upcoming stage of mobilization and, overall, let's say, a rather difficult autumn and winter ahead. This is according to our official representatives, who claim that, in principle, we now have the capability to carry out long-range ballistic strikes on the territory of the Russian Federation.
Mikhail, I'm curious to hear your opinion, on what matter. What do you think? Well, look, since so much has been said about this meeting, about the results of the meeting in Alaska, about this so-called spirit of Anchorage, no one was personally acquainted with it. But Moscow kept talking about it for a long time, and then, in the end, even accused the United States of supposedly betraying everything, when in reality everything was supposedly going so well. What are your thoughts on the matter? When that highly controversial and private conversation took place between President Trump and the Russian leader and dictator Putin, well, basically, they were already discussing the complex geopolitical situation regarding Ukraine back then, and it seems they were quite focused on it. And we know for certain, and have repeatedly stated on every possible international platform, that there should not be a single word about Ukraine without Ukraine. At this moment, the position of Washington, the position of the White House team, is that there is an absolutely clear understanding of this unbreakable rule, that it should not be this way. We do not talk about Ukraine without Ukraine, and even more so, we do not make any decisions without them.
I think the main imperative of the Trump administration regarding Ukraine, and in general the entire external aspect of its policy, is that it is, let's say, more subject to the situation. Undoubtedly, I believe that the Trump administration does not really bother itself with negotiating with Ukraine without Ukraine. It looks at, let's say, the current balance of power. It considers how both sides are doing now, how ready they are to continue the war, and how effective they are in waging it. And based on this, they are, let's say, tactically building their approach to the situation. That's why I think that in this case, everything will depend on Kyiv and Moscow, undoubtedly. And what we are seeing now is that the position of the United States is precisely based on Ukraine's successes, both on the battlefield, in long-range strikes, and let's say on Russia's defeats on the economic and social fronts. They also see sociological studies that show the collapse of Putin's approval ratings.
Mikhail, I'm interested in your opinion. What do you think actually needs to happen and from which side in order to force this whole Kremlin clique to sit down at the negotiating table? There needs to be increased sanctions pressure from Western partners, and I mean primarily the Europeans. There also needs to be a real intensification of sanctions pressure from our overseas partners, the United States. There should also be an escalation of Ukraine's long-range sanctions. Everything needs to work together. In your opinion, what could actually bring the Kremlin to the negotiating table?
Well, I won't be revealing any secrets here if I say that all of this really needs to work together, because the channels through which, for example, money flows into the Russian Federation are mainly located in Europe. Even now, despite all these sanctions, we see that, for example, the nuclear infrastructure, the nuclear sector of Rosatom, still services a large number of power plants in Europe on the territory of the former, republics of the Warsaw Pact. In fact, all over the world, there are, let's say, entire systems and mechanisms in place to circumvent sanctions and so on. The United States here plays more of a strategic role, yes, setting the general direction for the Western world in its relations with Russia. Because if Washington leans toward friendly relations with the Kremlin, then it's clear that all Western partners and the entire Western world will, let's say, gradually reduce the level of diplomatic pressure on the Russian Federation. But of course, the biggest key to Russia's position in this war, and more broadly to its overall policy, lies in Beijing. Because at the moment, it is Beijing that holds, let's say, the economic reins of control over Russia. The main market for the sale of oil and gas resources is in China. Therefore, of course, not just a lot, but rather the key volume of decisions made will depend on China's position.
Mikhail, what is your professional opinion? Do you believe the moment has finally arrived for Beijing to participate in a global effort, so to speak, to exert significant diplomatic pressure on the Kremlin to negotiate for peace? When will this happen? Indeed, in our broadcasts with guests and experts, we very often discuss this topic, that Beijing does have these levers of influence over Moscow, but it does not use them. It doesn't use them because, for one reason or another, it benefits from the continuation of the war. Russia is not weak enough yet. Is that the case or not? Am I mistaken?
It's not a question of China's benefit from the war. It's a question of the price China will pay, either for supporting the Kremlin or for forcing it to make peace. At the moment, China is supporting. It's important to note that it maintains relations with Ukraine as well, right? After all, a lot of components for various types of weaponry, particularly drones, are coming from China, right? That's why, in this case, China is taking a neutral position. But in this context, regarding relations with Russia, it's important to understand that Beijing's support for Russia, is currently bringing more dividends to China. That's precisely why this support continues. That's precisely why there is no pressure to force peace. As soon as Beijing sees that supporting this war brings more losses than profits, it will, of course, start leaning toward forcing Putin to sit down at the negotiating table. In this regard, it's important to understand that China does not have any assets or economic interests in Ukraine. This is a very big problem, because if Beijing had direct economic interests suffering in Ukraine, it would have already forced Putin to sit down at the negotiating table long ago. Therefore, in this context, it is very important to develop, I would say, financial and economic relations with Beijing in order to show them that we can be interesting as partners, and that the destruction of our infrastructure and the occupation of our lands is not beneficial to Beijing from the perspective of the overall geostrategic position.
Mikhail, thank you for taking the time to join our broadcast. We're glad to see you.
Thank you.
Mikhail Sinayuk, an expert of the Russian and Belarusian Studies program at the Analytical Center Ukrainian Prism, was in touch with the Freedom Studio.